So this is the last, unfortunately, the last panel of the day, in a discussion on the crisis in Venezuela. And to moderate the panel, I've asked Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, my former and current professor, my Frank Mora's former and current professor, and I think my current boss, if not my future boss. But with that, Dr. Gamarra, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and to see so many known faces. And really, I want to say just a couple of things before we get started. And sort of it's the privilege of being the former professor of so many people who are here, but also of so many of you who over the years have been coming to FIU. The relationship that we have with the U.S. Southern Command and with different instances of the U.S. government really goes back several decades. And I think those of you who know, in particular our president, Mark Rosenberg, who going back to the Contra days in the 1980s used to be traveling, of course, throughout Central America and really gearing up for these kinds of activities when FIU was FI-WHO, right? and today I'm really proud to say that we've come a long way, and I think that all of you know that just by coming to our conferences. And the kind of quality panels that we've had today really are a tribute to our university, but also to these two guys now, this duo dinámico that we have at FIU, Frank Mora and Brian Fonseca, who have really taken on this to really a new level. Those of you from Southcom who might remember us from the early 2000s, in fact, Mr. Ellis was telling me that he used to come here in the early 2000s, and he was a young man then, and and now today you're probably the most prolific person I know in terms of your weekly contributions to our understanding of the region. So I think what we've been able to do is really develop a dynamic of close collaboration between our university and your communities. And I think it's, it really is something to be, in this kind of era of so much negativity, I think it's important to have something positive to celebrate. So I wanted to start out just by making that observation, congratulating Frank, congratulating Brian, and then thanking the rest of you for coming here and joining us today. So my task is really one of great privilege, because I'm sitting, and you'll notice that I have chosen the middle here instead of the as other moderators did, and more because I think we want to have a conversation about Venezuela rather than having a set of individual prepared speeches. And the reason I think this is important is because we have four very, very important and knowledgeable people who of course have vast experience on the region and are really critical thinkers about the situation in Venezuela. So the way we're going to do this, I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to ask each of you to take no more than 3 minutes to answer the question, okay? And then we'll advance to as many of the questions as we possibly can. And of course, you may interrupt each other on occasion, but the idea is to try to get through a great part of this conversation before we turn it over to the audience. So without much more, let me introduce our speakers. Of course, and I'll start over here on my right with Roger Noriega. Roger Pardo told me that he was the other Roger, so I'll say that this is I've known Ambassador Noriega.
There are other things that distinguish us.
Yes, I know. But Roger has been a participant in many of our events, Journalists and Editors Workshop, a whole bunch of things going back to when you were a staffer many, many years ago. So our relationship goes back a long ways. Of course, everybody knows he was the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and today he's a visiting fellow at AEI at the American Enterprise Institute. So welcome, Roger. To my immediate right is Eric Farnsworth, of course, a very, very well-known spokesperson from the Council of the Americas, but also somebody who's continuously in the media and who's often in any language, really. I think it's primarily Spanish and English, but you'll find a good, coherent, centrist voice usually coming from the Council. On my left, Miriam Kornblith. Again, we go back several decades, and but an academic, a former public official in Venezuela in the electoral system there, and now, of course, at the National Endowment for Democracy. Miriam, thank you for coming again to FIU. You were just here a few weeks ago. And then last on the other side of Miriam is Dan Restrepo, who, again, really needs no introduction, like none of you. Just told us that he doesn't wear a tie anymore because his boss won't let him. But Dan is, of course, the former Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council, and he currently is at the Center for American Progress. So thank you, Dan, for joining us again. All right. So let me begin with a very, and really this is after we've gone through everything from the very beginning this morning. And let me begin with you, Roger. Let me ask you to tell us, what is American policy toward Venezuela today?
Well, I know there is a policy that I think President Trump has set forth, and then there's the State Department's policy. And I think you're going to see some convergence in terms of, with the transition there, with Pompeo coming in. And I've had the privilege of knowing Pompeo for years and talked with him about Latin America when he was a member of Congress from my home state of Kansas. And I think he'll put people in that will follow his lead. And his lead is from President Trump. And I talked to people at the very highest levels of this administration very early on, and it was pretty clear to me that President Trump had taken a very clear position on Mr. Maduro. And my impression is that they want to bring about change in that regime. Not tweak the behavior, but to bring about change in the regime. And unfortunately, and I think that's a smart conclusion, because we're dealing with this is a criminal enterprise, not a government. And so we should dispense with the fiction of, whether we have diplomatic relations or cordial talks and all this. We should unseal the indictments against the leaders. We should indict those that have been under investigation for 5 or 6 years, like Diosdado Cabello and others. And we should make it very clear through our diplomatic dialogue that this is a criminal regime. We will not do business with this regime which projects its threat well beyond its border, destabilizing as it has with vast sums of money accrued through involvement in narco-trafficking, destabilizing institutions of Central America, presents a problem on our border, now supporting certain candidates in Colombia and Mexico, and it represents an acute threat to our interests, and we have to get much more serious about how we respond to that. Yes, with some unilateral measures, and also working with like-minded countries in the world, really, that have recognized for themselves that this is an untenable situation, and the collapse of a country and the attack on democratic norms requires a response.
Eric, same question to you. How do you interpret U.S. policy? What is U.S. policy toward Venezuela?
Well, Eduardo, thank you. It's good to be back here at FIU. Thank you also to Southcom and also to the War College. I have the privilege each year to go up and give the capstone lecture at the War College, and it's a magnificent facility, and they really do outstanding work there. And it's also good to be between Roger and Dan, two of my friends. From my perspective, I'm actually to the left of Roger and to the right of Dan, which I think is, in the universal perspective, actually physically impossible. But from your perspective, I think we're probably aligned about right. Nonetheless, what is U.S. policy toward Venezuela? I think it's evolving, clearly. It's a policy that is actively being reviewed constantly. It's a policy that's in coordination with leading members of Congress, particularly the Senate. And it's a policy, I think, which sees where circumstances are, and then additional decisions are made based on that. So let me explain what I think I'm saying, which is to say that it is a policy to bring increasing pressure to raise the costs to the Maduro regime of anti-democratic and rejectionist behavior as the president of Venezuela and as the Venezuelan regime. Roger mentioned several things which threaten U.S. interests, and I would concur with that. I'd add a couple more. Certainly collusion with Russia in the context of undermining democracies throughout the region. We heard about that from previous panels. Certainly the drug trafficking, which is alleged to be facilitated, if not conducted, by senior levels of the Venezuelan regime, which is undermining democracies in neighboring countries, including Central America, Hispaniola, and others. We also see, for example, the huge humanitarian crisis. Is this a security threat to the United States? I wouldn't use that word, but it's certainly potentially destabilizing to some of our close allies in the region, including Colombia and Brazil and others. And again, those issues have been raised, and I think they're all very, very important. And then a final thing I would say is that the Venezuelan use or attempted use of the global financial system to launder money and to engage in corruption actually has a polluting effect in the context of the global financial system, and that's very much detrimental to U.S. interests. So what is U.S. policy wrapped up into all of that? I think it's to try to raise the costs of this behavior and bring Venezuela back to a place where they can begin to restore a democratic path and restore some semblance of economic sanity to a country that is really collapsing before our eyes.
Okay, thank you. Miriam, I want to ask you the same question. Is this policy effective? First, is there a policy, and how effective is it?
Well, I just came back from Venezuela. I came back last night. I spent 10 days there, and that's a question that people ask a lot. They are very interested in learning what exactly is the international community doing, because for the first time in, say, in the past 2 or 3 years, a main change in regards to Venezuela has been a much more active involvement of the international community, a higher awareness of what's going on, an understanding of the critical dimension, both of the political situation and the humanitarian situation. But people are looking for the international community as the last resource to solve this just desperate situation. So, assuming there is a policy, I just want to mention that people are hopeful, really are relying on the ability of the international community to help Venezuelans solve this intractable situation. I would say that the feeling and my perspective is that if there isn't a clearly and crafted policy and all its details, there is at least an approach. And I think this approach is more consistent in the sense of what both have already mentioned in terms of addressing the Venezuelan situation as a crisis and an intractable crisis, and understanding that those that are currently running the government in Venezuela are not just, political players that may be a little bit unusual or different, but characterizing them as criminal mafias or criminal players. I think that makes that changes the perspective. Also, being very aware of the humanitarian crisis that is taking place and the spillover and the consequences for the region, especially for the neighbors. I think that approach is part of this mix. having used the sanctions, I mean, both targeted sanctions and some kind of financial sanctions as part of this new approach. And I think one of the very important elements of the policy, of the approach, is trying to coordinate with governments and main players in the region and beyond the region. I mean, the European community too. So I think those elements seem to be part of a policy towards Venezuela.
Dan, the last word on this particular question. How do you see U.S. policy? And perhaps I had to ask you, is it any different than the previous administration?
Well, first I want to thank FIU and particularly Frank and Brian for the invitation to be here with all of you. And I'm impressed this number of people lasted this long into the day. And also, in the famous words of former Congressman Mo Udall, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it when it comes to the topic of Venezuela today. So to add my 2 cents, and to kind of throw off the construct of our seating arrangement, I'm going to start by agreeing with Roger. And I'm going to start by agreeing with Roger on a couple of fronts. One, I think it is best to understand the current power structure in Venezuela as a series of criminal enterprises that have a balance between them. Also agree that I think the most effective policy tool that we may have left at our disposal as the United States government is the unsealing of indictments, to the extent that they exist, against senior officials in the criminal enterprises that are currently running Venezuela. But I think that also tells us that we're out of policy tools. If that's your best policy tool, you don't have a lot of good policy tools. And one of the things that I'm struck by in this conversation, and struck both in listening to everything that has been said here today and in kind of reading the literature, if you will, in preparation for today, is I think we're very, very good at analyzing the problem at this point. But I also think we need to wrestle with the notion of whether the problem as it currently is constructed doesn't have a ready-made solution. Doesn't have a solution that Washington or even Washington and its friends can construct. And that there may not be players willing and able in Venezuela to effectuate the kind of change that was talked about earlier today. And how do you deal with the externalities of that? I'm not saying this is a reason for diminishing pressure, because I think pressure on particular actors within the power construct in the country makes sense. There's been a ramping up of that pressure, and I think that makes sense. I think in terms of in the continuity from the previous administration to this, you've had a deepening of the pressure exercised against particular individuals. I think that makes sense. You've got more coherence from the international community. I think that is a function of the absence of U.S. leadership rather than the presence of U.S. leadership. The need to fill a gap, a perceived gap that may not have been there before, and there was more kind of sitting around and waiting to see what Washington was going to do. But I think we all need to wrestle pretty significantly with the biggest externality right now, which is the humanitarian crisis, and how we can best position ourselves to help those countries immediately affected by it, and to think a little bit about what it means for the United States to be out encouraging others to welcome refugees and asylees when we as a country are doing just the opposite in crises all over the world, including Venezuela.
I want to get back to that in just a moment, but let me go back to this broad question and sort of ask you now, Roger, what is the effectiveness of these kinds of individual sanctions that all of you have somewhat touched upon?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very intelligent approach to go at the individuals responsible for the criminal activities, rather than sanction the country as a whole, which has all sorts of implications in terms of stigmatizing the country and every Venezuelan, as opposed to going at the assets of individuals. I think that kind of asymmetrical tool is important. It's a way of saying, look, we can't control all of your behavior, but we can tell you that you can't engage in these illegal activities with using the U.S. financial system. And so I think that's an important distinction from the sectoral sanctions. Saying banning imports of oil. Although I think we're getting to that point as well. It sends that message that those leaders, the vice president, the president of the country, are engaged in activities that aren't just anti-democratic, but they're criminal. And I think we can't afford to pull our punches. Even the people who are within the administration advocating this sanctions strategy, for example, people at Treasury, talk about incremental ratcheting up. My friends, this is a disastrous humanitarian crisis on our hands, right in our hemisphere. It's only starting to have, implications beyond its borders and being very apparent. We can't wait. And I think we have to be much more forceful. We have to go after the Diosdado Caballos. We have to go after, naming those names. We have to go after entities within that the Venezuelan military uses to garner resources. There's an organization called CAMINPEG, modeled on the Cuban Gaesa, which is a way for the military to sell oil and gold and accrue the profits directly. Go after those organizations, name names. Name the Cubans as the intellectual author of the destruction of Venezuela, and sanction individuals, Venezuelans as well, to send that message that we're serious about this. Break diplomatic relations with Venezuela and call on other countries to do the same thing. Recognize the democratically elected National Assembly as the legitimate representative of the Venezuelan people. Do the same with the tribunal, the Supreme Court that they set up. Endorse the activities that they're going through under their own power to call the regime out on its criminality and hold him accountable and eventually throw him out of office, and for that matter, recognize the legitimacy of a successor. So there are tons of things we can do that are far short of supporting a coup, which, by the way, it's such a mythology, even among Latin America, says the United States does coups. I'm pretty familiar with this process, and we don't do coups. But that doesn't mean this is Venezuelans' fault. I'm sorry, their responsibility. This is something that the Venezuelans have to solve for themselves. They will do the hard work, yes, but there are some things that we can do using asymmetrical tools to bring about a change in the regime and then help Venezuelans put it together with the support of the international community.
Perhaps what I'd like to do, Eric, is to thinking in terms of the sanctions, and really, sanctions take a long time to have an impact. As I look at our Venezuelan community here, which wants immediate change, right? They don't want these. While they're in agreement with the sanctions, they want immediate change. Are sanctions enough?
I think it's a key question. It's a very good question, and there's always going to be a conflict in terms of timelines, the time that it takes sanctions to really bite and the timeline that it takes to bring about actual change that is being demanded, even as the situation on the ground deteriorates markedly. And I think that's a very fair question. I think it's ultimately going to be answered in a very political way, certainly from the United States perspective. Are the sanctions that have currently been put on Venezuela enough? I guess it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to name and shame individuals, if you're trying to squeeze the financial resources to the regime, if you're trying to help build an international consensus that things are going the wrong direction in Venezuela and we need to work together to move forward, I think you can argue that this latest round has probably been a pretty good step with the potential for additional rounds later on. If the goal of the sanctions is to remove the Maduro government, clearly it hasn't happened. So I think we have to define what we're actually trying to achieve here and what are the best tools available to doing that. I am very mindful of the fact that this government, the Maduro government, has been very, very effective at finding ways to buy itself time and to consolidate its rule, whether it's through elections sanctions, whether it's through manipulation of international opinion, whether it's through loans and grants and financial assistance from other countries, no matter what it is, they're survivors, and they're very good at doing that, and it's existential for them because their one goal, in my opinion, is to remain in office. And if that's your goal, you're going to do everything you need to actually meet that goal, and that's just to survive in office, maintain that power. So at some point, it's quite conceivable that the international community will have to come to a point that says, look, the situation is so bad, it is a collapsed state, people are literally dying, and we can't wait any longer. At that point, that's a decision point. Are we there yet? I can't say we are. I can't say that we're not, but I would say the situation continues to deteriorate. One issue I'd like to put on the table as a way to think about some of these things, sectoral sanctions are going to probably be discussed at some point. We've already touched on them in this panel. That means energy, obviously. Energy, oil is the one sector that Venezuela still produces, although not nearly as well or as positively as they used to. To me, that is a really difficult issue that has to be addressed. But the reason why people are talking about sectoral sanctions is because it's the one lifeline to the regime. It's the way the regime gets its money. And what do they use the money for? To keep in power, right? To continue to dole out the goodies to the security forces, to continue to buy off a percentage of the population through the clap, through the food and access to medicine for a certain percentage of the population. If you somehow reduce that further or indeed end it, that's going to bring about, perhaps, the collapse of society that people think might lead to a change in government. But the question is, are we trying to collapse the society? And that's a tough question, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not here to be able to answer that. It is really tough. But meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis grows. So is there a way, and this is a question, I don't have the answer for it, but I'm increasingly intrigued by the possibility. Is there a way, instead of having the money for purchases of oil go to the regime to distribute the way it wants, to have the money that goes to purchases of oil go to humanitarian relief for the people that are actually leaving the country and are desperately seeking assistance in Colombia and Brazil, elsewhere? I know the structure of the international oil economy argues against that, but there are a lot of smart people out there. There are a lot of people that can probably figure this out to the extent that becomes an option that people want to actively explore. My point is, we're going to have to get creative because we're dealing with a crisis that arguably we've never seen before in the Western Hemisphere. And so some of the things that we would think about, we need to think about probably differently, even as we're trying to bring about positive democratic change to Venezuela.
Great, thank you. Miriam, you raised the international community, and now so has Eric. And one of the real issues, of course, has been that there appears to be this perception, at least, that the international community has not really been a good, how should I put it, partner, whether it was under the Obama administration or now under President Trump. What can the U.S. do to engage the international community more so, to bring to bear the kinds of things that both of our socios acá have just mentioned? I mean, what does it take to convince the rest of the democratic world to really exert pressure on Venezuela?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there has been a significant change in terms of the attitude and the ability of the international community to, first of all, at least realize and accept that there is a big problem in Venezuela, and we have seen much more coordination and I mean, much more access for Venezuelans. I mean, in the past, Venezuelans were traveling around the world, I mean, the democratic world, and were not received by governments or high-level officials. Nowadays, that has changed significantly, and high-level officials and statespersons all have the ear for the Venezuelan situation, and that's a very significant change. Well, I guess it's difficult to say, suggest, but first of all, I mean, coordination is critical. And when we are talking about the international community, we're talking about many players. And it's not a unified player. There are different interests, different bilateral or even triangular relations, as it was mentioned earlier. There are different interests. And I think generating a significant alignment across the different players, I think that's something that needs to be done. At this point, we have a very clear alignment in regards to how to address the upcoming elections. I mean, there's a very clear voice in terms of not recognizing these elections as free, fair, competitive, transparent, and because of that, nobody is really expecting that from these elections something meaningful or interesting or legitimate will come out. So I think that's something very important. Another aspect is all the financial pollution that the Venezuelan situation has created in all the in the Western Hemisphere financial markets. And that's a very significant problem. And there are tools, and if there are not tools, tools have to be developed to follow the perpetrators of all this pollution. And so going back to sanctions, sanctions have a very significant role in terms of pointing and identifying responsibles. I mean, the responsibility, personal responsibility. But beyond that, there also has to be like some kind of a penal responsibility. I mean, what is the consequence of having produced this devastation in the country and also having polluted the international system? So, I mean, it's not only about naming and shaming. I think it needs to go beyond that. And there are some cases, well, in terms of narco trafficking, the nephews of the presidential couple that are already in jail, these cases associated with PDVSA, recent cases in Spain with PDVSA again and Andorra. I mean, those going beyond just naming and shaming, I think that's very important, and there has to be alignment because these are international crimes. So there is a reason for the international community to be involved. On the other hand, there's a responsibility of the international community because all this money laundering was made possible through the international financial system. And on the other hand, there was a lack of commitment both in Latin America and beyond to really characterize and criticize and stop the continuous democratic and socioeconomic deterioration in the country. Only recently this has happened. So I think it's not only, that suddenly the international community has become more involved. I mean, there is a responsibility of the international community. There is a responsibility of Venezuelans and Venezuelan leadership and Venezuelan people, but the international community had a very relevant role in allowing for this situation in this hemisphere to expand and become the disaster that it is. So I think the international community should think very carefully how to be more effective.
Dan, let me ask you the question, but in a different way and sort of put you on the spot. There was a Summit of the Americas just recently, and as you know, the Summit of the Americas started here in Miami, and It was a U.S. idea. And for the first time, our president didn't go. In the context of trying to build an international coalition to address the situation, the humanitarian crisis, whatever, however you want to define the crisis in Venezuela, is the U.S. capable of leading that international coalition to achieve regime change in Venezuela?
So a couple of things. I think quite frankly, having a Secretary of State that speaks on behalf of the President of the United States will be a helpful piece of the puzzle. We've gotten to this point in the administration without that. I think the rest of the international community had recognized that, and it complicated things. So having a secretary who actually speaks on behalf of the president and has the ability to carry messages back and forth from the President of the United States will be helpful. But I think we're taking a too narrow view of the international community that matters here. The international community that matters here, it'd be nice if this was something that was strictly within the province of small d democratic countries in the Western Hemisphere. If it was, I think we'd be a lot closer to a solution today than we are. The isolation of Venezuela from the international financial systems, for example, is very difficult when their primary sources of financing are no longer the traditional international financial system but rather the strange economic relationships, to put it mildly, that they have with Russia and China. There I'm not sure in the rack and stack of global priorities from this president that on his China things to do list and his Russia things to do list, Venezuela figures particularly prominently. It would be helpful if it did, in the sense of trying to get them to seek a different kind of outcome than the one that's coming. So condemnation from the democracies of the West is a very good thing. It's a necessary thing. It's an insufficient thing. And I'm not sure the administration, and this gets into much broader questions of global priorities from this president and gets to scenarios I don't think we want to go to necessarily in this conversation. But again, the China and Russia to-do lists, I'm pretty sure don't have Venezuela on them. And as long as that's true, I think we're going to be in a harder place in terms of getting to a solution set because of the nature of the current cash flow that exists for this regime. This is it's an anomaly, right? It's a failed country with cash flow. And most countries fail when they run out of cash flow. These guys have managed to fail with cash flow, which is a pretty impressive undertaking. But to get to the regime dynamics itself, you get to the question that Eric was talking about, right? There are things that could be done to disrupt that cash flow. One of the things, and sectoral sanctions would be a big step in that direction. I think whomever is taking that thing, best think all the way through what that really looks like. Because right now, cash flow is allowing, for better or for worse, the regime to maintain the guys with guns on one side of the equation in Venezuela. If you take away cash flow, I'm not sure we know what happens to all the guys with guns, and whether what is already a humanitarian disaster gets that much worse. So I think we need to take a pretty holistic view of what the international community means here, and again, really understand what we're trying to achieve, and think about the first, second, and third order effects of taking bolder, bigger steps in those directions.
And if I may,
Thank you. Yes, please.
just for that comment, one just cautionary note. I mean, the humanitarian crisis is terrible.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I'm not questioning
I
that.
know.
Yeah.
And just to reinforce what you said, I mean, we should not underestimate that and the potential impact of additional measures that go beyond targeted sanctions to specific people. Because, I mean, coming from Venezuela yesterday, I mean, the devastation, the orphanages,
yeah.
the devastation in the country is terrible, and the weakest are the most affected. So,
yeah, and so many of you have worked in so many different countries, but I worked for 4 years in Haiti, and I know how countries can reach levels that are really, well below what one might expect, and still survive.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then
An economist once told me that one axiom, it can always get worse.
right, exactly.
And what I think we're all sort of saying is let's not mistake the collapse of the country for a collapse of the regime.
Right.
The regime subsists off of narco-trafficking, money they've already stolen, hundreds of billions of dollars looted from the Venezuelan people already. And again, those people that with their bundles in their arms and of all their possessions walking into Colombia, that's not a bug in the system, that's a feature of the system, which is the Cuban model of just busting out the country like they're busting out gangsters busting out a pizza parlor. And you're pushing all of the opposition out of the country, making it hard for them to subsist in the country. And the people that are left are dependent on what meager supplies in terms of food and medicine that they'll dispense. And it would be different if they were just hunkering down with this. They're lashing out. I mean, I think there's very good evidence that Venezuelan narco-traffickers associated with Tariq al-Assami are supporting presidential candidates or supporting mayhem in other parts of the hemisphere. I won't be too terribly specific, but you can guess what I'm getting at. So this is a problem that is going to get worse for us. And so when people ask, all right, you're going to force a change, what comes next? Well, I could try to answer that on the spot. We could probably come up with some answers. But why not sit down with the heads of the National Assembly? Why not sit down with the heads of political parties and talk about a transition plan so that we have some predictability? And not just the U.S. convene it, have the OAS convene it. And because, quite frankly, there are half a dozen people here who have elaborated plans. Venezuelans have perfectly capable engineers and private sector people, even some still living in Venezuela, who have already done that work. The politics, yes, it's tricky. But we have to do our part, which is make a commitment that we're going to bring about change. And when I say we, not just the United States alone, with the international community, but quite frankly, we all understand that when you're in a room with folks from Latin America and the United States and Canada, they always look at the U.S. representative and says, okay, what are you prepared to do? And I'm not sure that we have an answer to that, but we should. It's just a question of getting our foreign policy, getting the people in place who say we're gonna do this.
Time is moving very quickly, and I want to get to a couple more questions and then open it up for discussion. 16 countries just recently voted, right? Or decided that they will not recognize the winner of the elections. So let me just ask you about two scenarios, and not in any particular order, but what should the United States do if, as polls in Venezuela are saying, Henry Falcón wins? Eric?
Yeah, well, thanks for that one, Eduardo. Before I get to that very, very briefly, I think Dan is exactly right in terms of broadening out the coalition. It's got to go beyond the democracies of the Western Hemisphere. I've been arguing that for a long time, particularly with reference to China. Russia's a different story, but China, I think there's something there perhaps we can work with. But what was encouraging to me was just last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, with the World Bank IMF meetings in Washington, Secretary Mnuchin from Treasury brought together finance ministers, not just from Latin America, but from Japan, from Europe, Canada, et cetera, on Venezuela specifically, and I think that was a really important step. It did not include China, but that would have been a difficult, perhaps, seat at the table to have. But I think that's headed in the right direction, and so I think that's a very, very important point. I think so. The question about what happens if Falcón wins, I think that the international community should not change their view. It's an illegitimate election. It's not being run in a fair or free manner. If Falcón wins, okay, but it's through a fraudulent process, and I think the international community has every right to say, okay, if you take possession of the presidential palace, now you need to call a real election. And that's your next step. Otherwise, this continues to be an illegitimate process. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you have a process that's designed that is fundamentally anti-democratic, where the leading opposition leaders are either in jail or in exile, that's not a free and fair election. So at some point, it doesn't really matter who's elected. It matters whether the process is in place. It's clearly not if Mr. Falcón is elected, and who knows what's going to happen, in terms of elections. Anywhere these days, for that matter, but particularly in Venezuela, I think it's incumbent on the international community to say, all right, now let's see you try to run a real election. Release the political prisoners, open up the press and give everybody free access, or equal access, I should say. Make the political parties legal again. Change the electoral authority so that they're independent. I mean, asking for the full restoration of the rule of law is something that has to come eventually, but that's a long-term process. But the Supreme Court, all of the institutions of the state are dominated by not the government, but by the party. So until you can somehow get an independent process, the elections are by definition not going to be, in my view, the path forward. Can they be an interim step if they're used creatively, and if the Venezuelan people themselves come out to the streets again? I know this is a difficult thing to do, and I'm here in Miami. I'm not in Caracas. I'm not marching. It's easy for me to say go out and march, right? But I mean, people have to do that, and there are real difficulties in doing that. But if they not just abstain from the elections on May 20th, but actively resist the elections, in other words, rejecting them as a means to say the process is illegitimate. That then shows that the international community that this process is not according even to Venezuela's own constitution, and that then becomes the basis for continuing dialogue and continuing discussions on how do you actually affect the positive change that I think all of us are trying to talk about.
Okay, so let me just move us to May 21st. And we know the results, and I think we know them already, right? We know what's going to happen. So what should you do at that point? What should the U.S. do on May the 21st? What should the international community do on May 21st? You have people in Venezuela have voted, and however they voted, right? You have a new president. What are the next steps for the U.S. after? In fact, let me just add one more thing and kind of tie it into the discussion this morning. That government is now de facto. Is it okay now to talk about armed struggle, coup d'etats, and the like?
Well, first of all, Maduro's term ends in January 2019, so there's still a little room there. But of course, we shall see what happens. I mean, there's speculation that after Maduro wins, that then the Constituent Assembly will probably approve a new constitution, and this constitution will be approved, and this will rearrange the power structure, and who knows if elections will continue to be the way, the recognized legitimate path to select authority. So there's still a lot that can happen. But just from the formal point of view, he will continue being the president unless the Constituent Assembly decides differently. So, well, the surprises may come. I mean, if the international community and the U.S. has to continue to be consistent. I mean, those elections were not free and fair, or are not being conducted in a free, fair, transparent, competitive fashion. So those elections are what they are, produce. I mean, that result, which is not recognized, I think, to continue putting pressure on the government in terms of the financial system, I think there has to be a very strong initiative from the international community, and specifically from the U.S., to address the humanitarian crisis. I mean, this is a criminal government in terms of the way they're treating the people. I mean, it's not only because they're stealing, narco-trafficking. I mean, the impact that the devastation of the economy is having on every Venezuelan is just terrible. So I think that aspect is becoming more and more salient in terms of massive violation of human rights. And the fact that almost, I mean, the exact figures are still unknown. I mean, how many Venezuelans have left the country? But close to 10% of the population. And there are refugee camps in Brazil, in Colombia, and people are just fleeing the country. So it is a massive violation of human rights of a government that really doesn't care about the people. And they are so invested in remaining in power that they are caring less and less and less. So I think there has to be even a more consistent and strong response from the international community, because this election will only ratify what we already know, that this government is not about freedom and prosperity and well-being of the people. It's just about remaining in power. So it's just another opportunity to strengthen the same attitude, the same message, and hopefully to identify more effective tools. I think the situation is becoming so dire, is so critical, that there has to be an even stronger commitment to address this in a more effective fashion. I frankly don't have defined exact tools, but the perspective, there's no reason to change the perspective after those elections, because these elections will only ratify what we already know. And that is that these guys are in power just for the sake of power, not for any other reason.
Dan,
So as a lawyer, I should care about formalities, but here I think we get hung up on formalities. And let me start, nothing will have changed on May 21st. An illegitimate government holds an illegitimate election to get itself illegitimately reelected. Okay, the day on the calendar changed. That said, I think there's two things that the United States should absolutely not do, right? The first is they should avoid any congratulatory phone calls. And second, and more seriously, they should avoid, although
could
they should avoid creating false hope. And by that I mean, and this goes back also to the President of the United States, and is somewhat infamous of all options are on the table remark. I think we do a disservice to everybody in this process to create this kind of fleeting hope, expectation that somehow the fine men and women at Southcom are going to solve this problem. And there will be a temptation to be tough. There will be a temptation to say more, right? Will be to fall victim to do-moreism, right? That we need to do something more. And in the absence of a particularly well-defined more, we sometimes revert to tweeting. And I think we need to be very careful not to fall into that trap. And continue this kind of ratcheting up of pressure, if you will, but do it intelligently, do it in a manner in which you at least have some idea of where you want to be headed, rather than kind of improvise your way around a be tough moment.
And if I may add, just in very strong communication and interaction with Venezuelan players. I mean, let's not forget that there are Venezuelans struggling, Venezuelans defining strategies,
Right.
Venezuelans who are thinking about their country. Some very
along
leaders
those-
are here abroad too. So I think to avoid also the temptation of just the Lonely Ranger deciding the future of the country without communicating in a very strategic fashion with those that are inside or outside the country, but are also leading the process.
And the few and the only ones who still have democratic legitimacy in the country, right? I mean, you can never lose sight of that group of players, regardless of what the illegitimate government pretends to do to them.
Right.
They cannot leave the scene. It's in terms of a narrative.
Miriam, and let me turn back over here. Isn't the main critique of the opposition really that part of the reason why we are where we are is because of the opposition? So who are the Venezuelan interlocutors with whom you, I know I'm saying this on purpose, I know your point, but who are the Venezuelan interlocutors with whom we can work with?
Well, there are a lot of decent Democrats who...
I want you to quote that.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody just lift that clip, right? Just all by itself.
Little D Democrat.
There you go.
And otherwise. That's my concession for the day. That have done put a lot of work, risked a lot. Some of them are out of the country, some of them are still in the country. They have done, they've competed in elections, they've pressed for in the streets. And there, again, I want to say that, there a lot of them have done the planning. They know, they've prepared the landing. They have a sense of how you start to jumpstart the economy and get the political formalities right and interact with the international community, start to rebuild the country. Yeah, we don't know exactly, how the politics works out if there were to be a transition tomorrow. But there are a lot of decent people who are prepared to get in a room and work these things out. But we have to get there first. And the other point, these people are out passing the hat to raise money, to subsist. Believe me, Maduro is not having bake sales. But everybody in this town is probably, someone's, tried to contribute some money to a fund that's, either humanitarian aid or yes, political funds. I'm not saying, I don't know whether this is being done covertly or not, I don't think so. But, you know, why couldn't the U.S. government have a fund of that nature, do it through NED or the Organization of American States to help some of these people subsist? You have members of the National Assembly, you have some of these people from the court in exile driving Ubers. And when it comes to certifying that there's a genuine, legitimate leader for a transition, we're going to be getting on our Ubers to look for these Supreme Court members, and so there should be that kind of support. There should be support for community organizers and things like that, like in the Barack Obamas of Venezuela, the community organizers who work with communities. I know NED is doing some of this. I know IRI is doing some of this, but it all can't be through the mood. Because you can't just pay off political bosses. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, grassroots support. What if we were to say, I'll shut up. I'm using too much of my time.
But I think it's important what you're raising. But let me. There was an article in the Miami Herald this weekend about Venezuelans who are being deported, who have been denied asylum and who are now being deported. Thinking about the opposition and thinking about the Uber drivers, and I've gotten many of them, who are in fact, in precisely as you've described them. But should we be deporting people and at the same time telling the Latin Americans to accept all of these Venezuelan refugees? Aren't we being contradictory?
Well, I am very generous on the issues on immigration issues generally. Certainly, if someone has a colorable claim because they're being persecuted for political reasons, that comes under the heading of human rights violations and political asylum. And I know there's been a learning curve for our immigration system, because I've talked to some of these people, done pro bono, explaining to people what's going on in Venezuela. And up until about 6 or 7 years ago, these immigration judges, look, we were honoring Interpol requests against democratic leaders who were being persecuted by the regime. And so, we've got to get smart in that regard. And if someone has a political asylum claim, I think that we should, they should obviously under the law have an opportunity to espouse it.
Well, I'm getting, go ahead, we're getting the signal back there.
Fair enough, and I'll make it really quick. But, it's absolutely true that one of the complaints about the opposition is that they're divided. Well, first of all, I would note that it's not a moral failing to be divided. In our own political system, our own parties are deeply divided. So I think that's something to recognize. But the second point is that the regime has intentionally done everything it possibly can to divide them.
Right.
So, they're playing on a not level playing field, right? Their leaders, as I mentioned previously, many of their leaders are in jail, others are exiled, others have been co-opted, there's rumors of payments here and there. The point is that this is very much a regime strategy. So it's not just like the leaders of the opposition can't get in the same room and divide and discuss something. I think it goes a lot deeper than that. The second thing, and again, very quickly, Roger raised a really interesting point in terms of funds available for organizing. My first job at the State Department in 1990 was on the Panama desk, and those of you who remember what happened in 1989 recognize that was right after Operation Just Cause. And in the run-up to Operation Just Cause, there was a determination by the U.S. government that payments from the Panama Canal usage, which was being administered at that point by the U.S. government, would not go to the Noriega regime, not your Noriega regime, but the Noriega regime in Panama, right? And so they were escrowed, and they were made available to the legitimate government of Guillermo Endara, which had been democratically elected but not allowed to take power. My point is that there was a very large amount of money that was available, and it was completely legitimate, transparent, fully accounting, all of that. but it was made available for the operations of the democratically elected government. That was a model that, sure, there are some real differences with regard to Venezuela, et cetera, but I think Roger's raising a very interesting point. I mean, if the opposition has to live hand to mouth, it's kind of tough to organize against a dictatorial authoritarian regime. So that's something I think to keep in mind.
Yeah, Dan?
A 5-word answer to your last question.
Yes.
Yes, we are being hypocritical.
Yeah.
And Miriam has a very articulate defense of the opposition, and you've seen it. I just saw it, so maybe you want to just tell us, you know.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that's my...
Unfair not to let
Yeah,
you.
and also I want to recognize that there are two very important leaders of the opposition here, David Smolansky and Carlos Vecchio, who had to flee the country.
Yeah.
They're in exile. They're in exile not because of they chose to be in exile, they had to. So, I mean, I think I always, anytime I have the opportunity, I want to highlight what kind of struggle has the Venezuelan opposition had to face during this, throughout these 20 years of this terrible regime. But if you examine the policies and the politics of the Venezuelan opposition, you will see that the opposition has gone as a unified front to all the elections, continues to be unified in front of this election, despite the fact that Henry Falcón is running. The main court of the main, organized opposition parties are unified in the same message and the same approach. So the struggle that the opposition has carried out throughout all these years has been, from the principal point of view, it has been a democratic struggle, it has been an institutional and electoral struggle, and that's, it's based on principles, it's based on assuming that those are the worthwhile and the really valuable ways to channel this situation in the country. And from the organizational point of view, the opposition has presented unified candidates at least since 2006, and before that also in additional elections. And the opposition not only has done that, has won elections, has been successful in their own policy. If we were talking about a struggle against, or in the context of a democratic or a little bit, kind of a little off kind of a government, all these successes and all these efforts would have been translated into a new correlation of power, a different set of government officials being there. However, it's not a democratic government. We know that for sure. And the Venezuelan opposition is facing a very unequal and, say, non-democratic struggle. So I have to say that I frankly admire, respect very much the Venezuelan opposition. I know that the Venezuelan opposition is admired and respected throughout the region in situations such as the Nicaraguan situation, the Bolivian situation, Ecuadorian situation. They have looked for advice and counsel from the Venezuelan opposition that was able to put together a broad alliance with different parties, and however, be able to present unified candidates throughout all these elections. So it has been, I would say, a very strong democratic reference, and it continues to be, and it's a main ally to deal with this kind of regime. So that's why I insisted in the fact that anything that is decided or defined or designed has to take into account the voice, the views, and the participation of this very relevant player.
Even though we're in Miami, we are running on Anglo time, so. And I do want to open up the floor now for questions. I think we can take two questions or. Okay, so let me go first with Beatriz over here. Let me take 3 questions. Is that okay? All right. Roger, we won't take 12. 3, okay? All right.
Go ahead.
Okay. Beatriz.
Thank you, Eduardo. I wanted to ask the 2 panel members that have been government officials to explain to me, because I'm really confused now, how can you explained that the Department of Justice spent almost $10 million in prosecuting the FIFA leadership on the accounts that they were money laundering, financing terrorism, and going into counterfeiting. And they have spent not a cent in going after the Venezuelan ruling clique that is engaged in exactly the same thing and the same international convention that was applied to the FIFA leadership applies to them, which is the United Nations Convention against transnational organized crime. Thank you.
Okay. You want to take that?
Sure. I'll go first. I mean, we're going to take one question at a time?
Yeah, let's take
okay,
one
good.
question
That's
at
fine.
a time.
I'll zip through it.
Then we'll,
We
because
have-
it's a complicated one. So
My educated guess is we've spent millions, tens of millions of dollars in the investigation of the Venezuelan officials, going back 10 years. You notice the Wall Street Journal recently won a suit in federal court that Diosdado Cabello had brought, saying that there was no evidence that he was under investigation. Well, the judge dismissed it because the judge knows full well that the Eastern District of New York, which did the FIFA prosecutions, the Southern District of New York, Southern District of Florida, and Houston all have open investigations. And I think they ought to bring them together, all these, and Attorney General Sessions should have a press conference, maybe the president can be there, and announce omnibus indictments of dozens of Venezuelan officials who we know and have documentary evidence and witness testimony are involved in criminal activities, money laundering, trafficking, that would be a remarkable move to brand this regime for what it is, a criminal enterprise. And I think it would be pretty powerful statement about which the international community could rally and say we have to come up with a more creative, robust solution to solve this problem, because that criminality represents a threat to our security.
Dan?
Nothing to add.
Okay. All right, let's go over here to the mayor.
You're in complete accord,
Basically, yeah. I mean, I said it at the top.
more or less.
By the way, one of the FIFA officials is from Venezuela. He's arrested. Just one, I would like to make a comment and a question. About Henry Falcón, I think it's a perfect design by the regime, to the point that we're talking about that topic here. I mean, does anyone has a doubt that Putin was going to lose in Russia? I don't think anyone that had a doubt. So with Maduro is pretty much the same, even though Putin has much more popularity than Maduro, but it is designed for them to win because it's not a free and fair election. Other thing that I would like to share with you, yesterday I talked to a 22-year-old Venezuelan, he's in Trinidad and Tobago. And when I called him, he was so afraid because the government of Trinidad and Tobago deported 82 Venezuelans. They were treated like criminals in the embassy of Venezuela. And what it was more incredible is that they were taken back to Venezuela in a military airplane that was sent by the regime. They are now hidden in Venezuela. Some of them has escaped. They were with the passport. So what can we do in some Caribbean countries to shift their positions about the regime? And also, sorry for another question, is there any study or do you have the information about how much money has the regime through illicit activities such as drug trafficking, mining trafficking, and gasoline trafficking? Thank you.
Anybody have an answer to that question?
I'm
Can
not-
you quantify?
I'm not aware of a study. Maybe there has been. Maybe the intelligence community has something like that. Clearly, it would be a valuable contribution if somebody were able to quantify that in a meaningful way. The question about the Caribbean, I think, is really, really interesting. It is fascinating to me that microstates of the Caribbean, some which have long democratic traditions and history, have been able to stymie the will of the hemispheric community in the OAS, it's some of the Americas and elsewhere, and by providing political air cover to a despotic regime in Venezuela. That's fascinating to me. Dame Eugenia Charles is probably twisting in her grave. I mean, there are some real stalwarts of democracy that the English-speaking Caribbean and others through the years have established through their own traditions. So this is not a traditional perspective. I mean, sometimes you hear about sovereignty and traditional Latin American foreign policy. This is not a traditional position of the English-speaking Caribbean. Their traditional position is to support democratic governance. So you have to think something else is going on here. And it gets to the real question of payments and political incentives and such things. And so I think going to the discussion we've been having with Roger and Dan and of course Miriam as well, on the corruption side, if some of this can be frankly exposed, that's the first step. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Show what these guys are actually receiving, if they are. I'm not, who knows, but if they are, number one. Number two, and this is a broader question, it's been ongoing for years, it will continue most likely to go on for years, it would be, to my way of thinking, a real benefit to the United States to have a more active strategy with the Caribbean nations. I know Congressman Engel and others have been real stalwarts in that way. In particular, cleaner energy, natural gas. We have the resources. We've been talking about this for years. I don't understand why we can't get it done. On purely environmental terms, the Caribbean is burning bunker fuel. That's about the dirtiest, most carbon, intensive fuel that you can possibly burn, and these are island countries worried about rising sea levels. I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense if we can somehow incentivize the use of cheap, cleaner natural gas from the United States. Not only is that good for political reasons, it's good for environmental reasons, and it delinks from Venezuela. So this is something that people like me and others have been talking about for about a decade. And I don't understand why we can't get it done. I'm not saying that that would be the silver bullet to try to de-link the Caribbeans politically from Venezuela, but it sure would be a good place to start.
I have just a brief comment. I mean, we all know that the Brazilian scandal, the Lava scandal, Odebrecht, has shaken the region. There are former presidents, current presidents in jail or indicted. And that scandal, according to the New York Attorney Office, involved $800 million in briberies. $800 million. Anything coming or related to a corruption scandal in Venezuela involves billions,
Right.
billions. I mean, 10 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion. There are some accounts. Some of the figures raised to $300 billion that have been, stolen from the country. I mean, I don't know if that is an exact figure, but if we just add the just reported corruption schemes that we know about, $800 million, Lava Jato, that has shaken the region. I mean, it's an enormity. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
And to underscore this, I think the actions of the English, there's some in the English-speaking Caribbean, are very clearly understood, first as a function of bribery, and now as a function of blackmail. But the blackmail in the sense that they have the goods on the folks that they bought off for quite some time. And there's an antiseptic for that. There is bringing that to light that very well could cause political disruption in some of these countries, but apparently well-justified political disruption in some of these countries, to start changing the dynamics. I mean, this goes back to the notion, again, our best tool, again, it speaks more to the toolbox than the tool itself as far as I'm concerned, is exposing more of this corrupt activity through indictments and through making that very clear. And I think it could have interesting second-order effects in the English-speaking Caribbean, because clearly the bribery piece of the play has kind of run its course, and the why folks kind of persist in their support, I think, is largely a function of the goods that somebody has on them, and that again could make Odebrecht look like a quaint undertaking.
Let me just say on that one Caribbean point, and I say this with all due respect, who cares what the Caribbean thinks about this problem?
Yeah.
With all due respect. Because it's a problem that goes well beyond the Western Hemisphere.
Yes. Yeah.
And we have allies around the world that are working with us on this, Europe and elsewhere. And we don't need a vote of the Organization of American States to do anything
Right. But
in this regard.
But Roger, to his point, I think that the 82 Venezuelans who were shipped back to Venezuela by a Caribbean country care. I mean, how can you affect that kind of behavior also, I think, is part of the
Well,
equation.
I'm sure that the reason they're doing that is not just for political reasons.
Right.
The gas,
But you did make a specific
Yeah.
point about
gas,
Trinidad and Tobago.
Right.
gas
So just-
deal between the Venezuelan
Yeah.
government and
I see.
Right.
But I mean, I'm not saying that to totally diss the Caribbean folks, because a good number of them are with us on this.
Yeah,
But
an increasing
in
number.
point of fact, we don't need a vote at the OAS to conduct our foreign policy. It's a nice thing to have if you need it, and they'll come around once you put all your cards on the table and show that the Venezuelan people wanted this change.
I'm being told to stop back there, but I'm not going to stop. Simply
You can
because
take your stop sign.
That happened. Braille.
Roger's from Kansas, remember? So, and I'm going to ask for very brief questions so we can take them all. And the reason I want to get your questions is because I know that you see all those panels back there. You know, this is some really good work that our students have done, and I think it's. They haven't had the opportunity to ask questions. I've seen you get up a couple of times, and you've had to sit down. So, you're on.
Thank you. Desiree Gonzalez from the FIU's Model United Nations program. I would just briefly like to more or less pick the panel's brain in the long-term aspect of the Venezuelan crisis. What would it look like, or more or less, what is the possibility of the Venezuelan crisis elevating to a status that would require U.S. intervention to whatever extent, whether that be military or whether that be more direct humanitarian aid, as we have seen in Syria? Moreover, in the context of a possible proxy war between Russia and China and the U.S. fighting for influence in the region through Venezuela.
Boy, she thinks big, doesn't
See?
she?
That's why we needed a question from our
Thinks
students.
big.
Thank you very much.
And I'll take the three.
Yeah, let's take all three, and so your question as well. Remember it now. Okay.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out here. Alexander Morales from the Green School. Quite simply about the OAS again. Now, we may not need a vote in the OAS. Is there a justifiable concern that if we act without multilateral legitimacy, that we're giving credence to propaganda claims by the Venezuelan government that it's just Yankee imperialist against them, and that all they need is to batter down the forts and hold out?
Okay.
Yeah.
And the final question right back over
So
here.
my question is regarding political dissidents. What exactly is the consequence of arresting political dissidents such as Leopoldo Lopez on the daily struggles of the Venezuelan people?
Okay, so I'll leave.
what was that?
Who wants to take?
I'll take the
Roger,
first
you
one.
wanna
I
take
didn't hear
first?
the very last question, but
I'll repeat it for you.
so this is a major concern for the folks with uniforms on, because there's recent evidence and testimony that I'm aware of. It's available to the United States government, DEA, eyewitnesses, people who are well versed in this, of FARC camps deep into Venezuelan territory, basically forming a cocaine corridor back all the way around the country, the Orinoco, up back to the Caribbean coast, ready to get to the Caribbean and Europe with drugs. The support of that government, of the complicity, the complicity of that government in Caracas, in the terrorist organizations, criminal organizations operating in their territory with impunity, is the casus belli for Colombia. And you're going to have a new president who is going to have a very dim view of this kind of activity. Even the current president does, Santos, and he's put some information out on indictments and involvement of the FARC, and that is a major challenge. And I'm not saying that it's going to necessarily become a fighting war, but the Colombians may have to feel that they're compelled to do something about that, with U.S. support, with broader support, but they may realize that they can't sustain their own national security while Venezuela is involved in this kind of activity with impunity.
Okay. Anybody else want to take that? About the question on the OAS?
I would say that it's always better to have international support to the extent that it's possible. I mean, again, the OAS as a body by consensus has shown to this point that it hasn't been able to achieve consensus, in part because Venezuela is a party to the, certainly in the organization. So it's difficult, if not impossible, through that particular institution. Doesn't mean I don't think we shouldn't try. Doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to work with multilateral groupings such as the Lima Group, and the numbers continue to expand, and that's a good thing, and Venezuela's supporters continue to contract in terms of numbers. Now Ecuador is at least abstaining from, previous support. So I think there's positive movement there. The obvious question is how much longer can we last, right? I mean, there is, again, what I said at the beginning, there's this timeline, right? Things get markedly worse. How much time do you have to get all your diplomatic ducks in a row? I guess what I would say is at the point where the United States believes that our core national security interests are at stake, that changes the dynamic from the perspective of the use of force. I'm not sure that, you've got, the drug trafficking, humanitarian, Russian meddling, all these things which are security threats. But are those core U.S. national security issues? It's not North Korea we're talking about. It's not Iran. And I think you have to put it in that perspective, too. Here we are talking about Latin America and the Western Hemisphere and Venezuela. I go back to Washington on an 8 o'clock flight tonight, and all of a sudden I'm back in the world of North Korea and Iran. And where is Venezuela in that equation? So, maybe there is additional time in terms of building the international coalition. It is a balance. It is a balance. And on balance, it is, of course, it's much better to get diplomatic support to the extent possible.
Okay. And then the final question, I don't know if you heard it. You want to
I'm not sure I understood. I fully
repeat
understood.
your question very briefly?
All right. So, what is the consequence of arresting political dissidents on the daily struggles of the Venezuelan people?
Well, the consequence is terrible. I mean, as I said, I just came back from Venezuela last night, and you can feel a sense of exhaustion in everybody, in ordinary people, but also in the opposition. The opposition has had to face a terrible struggle throughout these 20 years, and specifically in these last 4 or 5 years with the incarceration of Leopoldo Lopez, the banning of Capriles, and, on the main figures, opposition leaders, with the mayors that had to flee the country, the members of the Supreme Court that were appointed by the National Assembly. I mean, the dismantling of the organized opposition, the legitimate players, the legitimate parties and leaders has been terrible in terms of weakening the ability of the leadership to communicate in a fluid fashion with everybody, with normal citizens. And this is coupled with the fact that there's no free media, no access to the media, to opposition figures, no access to financial instruments to carry out democratic campaigns. So it's not only about targeting leaders, it's the whole institutional setting that this government has put together. Institutional is a fancy word. I mean, it's through legal and non-legal means, the way that the government has tried, but has not succeeded yet, has tried to eliminate the opposition in Venezuela. Fortunately, Venezuelans are very, there's a very, resilient community in Venezuela, resilient democratic community, both at the leadership and the ordinary people levels, that have been able to continue the fight for democracy in the country. And that's why, again, I insist that those are the main players and the spokespeople we have to take into account and bring into the design of any kind of policy. But indeed, it has exercised a toll on the ability of Venezuelans to resist this government.
Great. I would suggest that you talk to the mayor.
Yeah.
Right there, and I'm sure that he'll be able to answer the question.
The mayor and also Vecchio, who had to, a main leader that had to flee the country.
In any event, thank you so much. I have been really privileged to be able to sit here in the middle and to have this conversation with you all. Thank you so much for coming to Miami. Thank you again, Brian and Dr. Mora, and
Thank you.
We're done.
So just give us just 2 or 3 more minutes as we close out. I think there's some important things that we'd like to do. One, on our behalf, I'd like to thank the people in the room that really made this happen. Patty Sapero, you're in the back there. Where are you at? If you could stand up. Hector, David, Aldo Fonseca, Randy Pastana, Martha Rivera, Cynthia Del Rio, and of course our students that really put in a lot of work to make this happen. So, and Patty from my office. I mean, we're the ones getting credit for this, but the reality is it would not have happened, not even remotely close, without the work that they put into making this happen. So truly, sincerely, thank you. I'd also like to thank the students that put together presentations. If you had a chance to go over there and see some of that work, I think it's really good. They don't know this yet, but I'm going to announce the winner of that. There was a competition going on. These are students that are destined for internships, and so there was a monetary stipend awarded to the winner. And so I want to just first thank our judges. So Dan Restrepo, Saif Ashuf, who's our VP for engagement, Andres Martinez Fernandez, former student now, big policy guy up north, Rich Caceres, Southcom, and one of our faculty members, and then Martha Rivera. Thanks for judging this. Our students, Cynthia Hale, Jacob Pardavi, Diana Martinez, Corey Mikel, Simran Sarkani, Kyle Rogoyo, Gabriel Costantino, Carlos Salvat, and Natalie Garcia Zimmerman were all of the students that put presentations together. The challenge was it wasn't easy to get to a single winner. There was a 1-point difference that separated first, second, and third. And so we've decided to give all 3 stipends, and so let me announce them. First is Jacob Pardavi, if you can stand. That first runner-up was Sydney Hale. You can stand. And then our second runner-up, Simran Sarkani, if you can stand. So on behalf of myself, the Institute for Public Policy, and our team, thank you so much. I'd like to turn it over to Frank for just a few minutes.
Well, first of all, I want to just thank all of the panelists and the moderators who led each of our panels, and thank you all for being here. We're just pleased to get the lineup that we got today, and we have our work set out for us next year to be able to match this conference next year. I do want to thank my friend and colleague, Brian Fonseca, first for tolerating me, but second, because that could be a problem. But anyways, but the truth is that him and his team did enormous work to make sure that this was put together. And so it was very privileged for me just to support and advise and bring some of these people together. And I promise you, and I hope that you all here next year, because we're going to do this again. The idea is to institutionalize these kinds of events. We are in interdisciplinary centers. My center, the Latin American Caribbean Center, and the Gordon Institute are interdisciplinary centers committed to training our students, supporting our faculty in the research they do both in the academic world and in the policy world. And we are committed to continuing supporting that, as you can see from the research and the posters. So get your calendars out. I don't have a date, but around May, maybe April, we're coming back and we're inviting you all to be here. Thank you all for being here. Thanks.